Okay, hi, Professor Reimers here again, and we're back on the ski trail, ready to talk about Chapter 2 today, and I'll get right into it, not waste any time. All right, so Chapter 2 is broken down into 3 parts, and those 3 parts all talk about the same answer to a question that is fundamental to the beginning of the chapter, and that question is, what changed from the laissez-faire drug policy that existed prior to the 1900s in America? So the 3 parts of the chapter are all discussing an answer to that question, what changed. Laissez-faire, by the way, means hands off. Comes from the economist Adam Smith when he was talking about the freedom of business from government tariffs and regulations and so forth. So that's classical economic policy from A Wealth of Nations, Smith's famous work. So hands-off policy in the 1800s. There were state laws, certainly, and local municipalities passed laws about what might be legal or not in their states or cities. But there was no real federal laws until 1906. So the reason that federal laws, caught my stick. The reason that federal laws were started to be put into place starting in 1906 had to do with 3 things. They are toxicity of drugs, the way in which people could become dependent on drugs, aka addiction, and that drugs are correlated with crime. Remember, a correlation is not a causation. So this is what the chapter discusses. Okay, so you get to the top of the hill here. Let's find a trail that can move along faster. Toxicity of drugs is the fact that drugs are, in a sense, poisons. They are toxic to human bodies in the sense that they change the normal functioning of the human body. The human body has a homeostasis, like a relatively constant body temperature, relatively constant breathing patterns, heart rates, and so forth. And that homeostasis is changed, as with the taking of drugs. That can be helpful, certainly, in the medicinal cases, but it can also cause great harm, as in the cases of the slowing heart rate of an opioid user, to the point where the heart rate may stop entirely and may not start again. That's a drug overdose death on opioids. So toxicity is obviously serious and important. Federal laws started to be passed addressing issues of toxicity again in 1906. But prior to that, there were no federal laws about whether or not you could put a poison in a wine, like opiate wines. They were common. Cocaine wines were common. There was opium in toothache pills, in child's cough medicine. It's a relatively common so-called quote-unquote cure for coughing diseases like whooping cough or pertussis or other croup and so forth, other lung illnesses of infants. So, of course, it wasn't a cure. It was just a salve, if you will, a Band-Aid. But it was common, and it was used frequently until that was banned, I believe, in 1914. So, toxicity is the first issue. Back on the trail, here we go. Second issue is dependence. The fact that people become dependent on drugs is obviously a serious problem. I asked you to write about that in the recent discussion, so I'll be looking over those discussion posts shortly. Dependence is defined by the psychological associations, American Psychological Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I believe we're on edition 5, perhaps up to 6 now, but soon, if not yet. But the definition is in the notes. I'm not going to go over every point, but it essentially involves the use of a substance, a drug, as we've defined it, a chemical substance that is difficult to stop. It is interrupting social and work relationships. It is causing withdrawal symptoms, physical dependence. Is about withdrawal symptoms, how your body reacts when you remove a substance that it's gotten used to. Tolerance develops, requiring a greater dosage of a drug to get the same effect, and that can lead to problematic outcomes. So all of these issues with dependence are important issues that began to be more well recognized in the 20th century, the 1900s. All right, so the third issue is crime, and essentially, trail again. Essentially, the issue of crime is correlated again with drugs. Drugs do not necessarily cause crime. It would be ridiculous to claim that, look at that ibuprofen gang trying to obtain illegal drug. If you made ibuprofen illegal, sure. But there's nothing inherent about drugs that lead to criminal activity, aside from how they may change psychologically inhibition, social inhibition, like with alcohol, which might lead to a greater likelihood, perhaps, of norm breaking, rule breaking, law breaking, perhaps. So there's that issue. And of course, drugs are, some recreational drugs, illicit drugs are illegal and fetch a high price because of their status in the black market. And that money can be very much tied to crime and criminal activity. So, but I think it's important to remember that it's not the drugs necessarily that are causing crime. It's just that these things are correlated together.
All right, back at home in front of the fire now, and I'm going to summarize High Price chapters 1 and 2 for you. I accidentally summarized chapters 3 and 4 on the ski trail this afternoon, and I'll play that clip for you next week. Chapters 1 and 2 of High Price reveal Carl Hart's very young history, and starts with a vignette or story of his young life as his parents were fighting and his father was using alcohol. Certainly not a rare occurrence in American society these days. I think one of the most important points made in the book, the entire book, in my opinion, is on page 13 near the beginning of chapter 1, where he, after defining the term addiction clinically using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, as a person's drug use interfering with important life functions like parenting, work, and intimate relationships, use that continues despite ongoing negative consequences and taking up a great deal of time and mental energy, persisting in the face of repeated attempts to stop. And that is the case, he says, from, well, he goes on in the next paragraph. I'll read it directly because it is so important. More than 75% of drug users, he says, whether they use alcohol, prescription medications, or illegal drugs, do not have this problem. Research shows repeatedly that such issues affect only 10 to 25% of those who try even the most stigmatized drugs like heroin or crack. So he's talking about problematic use of addiction as not being quite as common as we sometimes might imagine amongst those population of people who use drugs, illicit or otherwise. It's a relatively small proportion, 10 to 25%, that becomes addicted clinically to the drugs that they use. So I think that's a very important point. He goes on to talk about the goal of the book, and he defines institutional racism and looks at the effect of that on society and the relationship to drugs and that source of conflict. On page 17, he makes an important point about how high unemployment rates in deindustrializing American society in the 1960s and 70s were correlated with increases in crack cocaine use, but what's not well known is that the crack cocaine use was happening in the 1980s, and the unemployment preceded the cocaine use rather than following it. So the story being told was in fact confusing cause and effect, blaming drugs for the effects of, in fact, poor drug policy, poverty, institutional racism, and many other less immediately obvious factors. He finishes the text by talking about that crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and how that has led to a crackdown, as described by another author, Michelle Alexander. Very good book that he mentions at the end of that chapter, talking about that interconnection between institutions and drug policy and outcomes that are often negative in many communities that suffer from high unemployment, that suffer from institutional racism and other social ills. So that's chapter 1. We'll be right back. Chapter 2 in High Price is titled Before and After. I really enjoyed the quote at the beginning of the chapter. I won't repeat it for the sake that you can read it in your own version or online. But he discusses, I think, overall in this chapter, the theme is power, social power. And he discusses social power in terms of several different characteristics that are related to how power is exercised in society. But I want to point out very specifically a term that he defines in this beginning of this chapter on page 23 of my copy of the book here, the paperback copy. He defines the term reinforcement, a very important term in this class, especially when it comes to understanding dependence. Reinforcement, he says, well, he gives an example at first. For example, when I help my father mow the lawn or fix the car, I'd get patted on the head or be given other types of encouragement. In behavioral psychology, this process is called reinforcement. The more immediate the reward or reinforcement following the behavior, the more robust and frequent that behavior becomes in similar situations. And so I quickly learned that emulating my father was what I should do. Positive and negative reinforcement are terms that will become very important in understanding dependence or addiction, as we often call it. Going on to the chapter, he addresses the issues of gender and power, masculinity as a certainly personal trait that's related to power. He looks at race and institutional racism, the implicit biases that exist, and the unconscious white power that exists in society on pages 26 and 27. He again turns to gender and power on page 28. And then he starts looking at the importance of language. I think that's an interesting section of the text where he reveals the findings of several studies on language in childhood and its effect on the child's experience in terms of class. He brings class into the analysis, which of course always invokes issues of power. This is all related to conflict theory and sociology. So after looking at language, he then turns his attention to the family institution and reveals the results of a number of studies about family of different class situations and what the outcomes for children often are. And that kind of sets up for the later chapters a discussion of how those power institutions and outcomes for different classes are related to drugs and drug policy. All right, we'll be back in next week with chapters 3 and 4. Thanks, bye.
Comment on that. In the upcoming assignments, we have a bi-weekly journal coming up. This is going to ask you to, not this week, but next week, I believe, which is going to ask you to comment on chapters 3 through 5 of High Price. You have a online media assignment this week. Chapter 2, I believe, has to do with the history of drugs. I'm catching up after the discussion post from last week, and this week's discussion post is about dependence and our experience with dependence, drug dependence. I have my own experience in my own family, several cases, and I'm sure somebody in your life has been affected in some way by drug dependence. But I appreciate your honesty, and you have my confidence in reading those. Appreciate your sharing. And I'm about to go down a big hill, so here we go. See you in the next video.